a girl, but she's on fire. You know the bed feels warmer, sleeping here alone. You know I dream in color and do the things I want. You think you got the best of me, think you've had the last laugh, bet you think that everything good is gone. Think you left me broken down, think that I'll come running back. Maybe you don't know me 'cause you're dead wrong. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Stand a little taller. Doesn't mean I'm lonely when I'm alone. What doesn't kill you makes a fighter. Footsteps even lighter. Doesn't mean I'm over 'cause you're gone. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, stronger.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3, where we are focusing on self-care. I'm so happy that you joined us today, and it is truly an honor to be sharing this moment with each of you. As a reminder, please take care of yourself today. The last 24 hours have been long, emotional, taxing. We want to make sure that you are checking in, that you're leaning into your thoughts and emotions, that you're creating space for awareness internally and externally, and also check in with your people, your friends, and your loved ones, because as you know, we are stronger together. We are truly in store for a powerful speaker for our opening session today, and I can't wait to soak in all she has to share. Dr. Taryn Marie Staskell is a foremost international expert on resilience in both leadership and life. She is the former head of executive leadership development at Nike, global leadership development at Cigna, and founded Resilience Leadership, where she serves as the Chief Resilience Officer, leveraging over a decade of research on resilience that gave birth to the empirically based framework, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, for executive coaching, top team effectiveness, high potential leadership programs and workshops, and inspirational keynote addresses. She is a sought-after coach for executives, athletes, musicians, and actors who are looking for an edge by way of understanding and harnessing their inherent resilience. Dr. Taryn Marie is the author of Flourish or Fold, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, and is featured in the forthcoming documentary, Breaking Free, both expected to release in 2021. Without further ado, Dr. Taryn Marie Staskell.
Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. What a wonderful honor to be with you here. Here we go. Okay, I don't know if you heard that first part. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. I am so delighted to be with you on this momentous occasion. As you know, there have been a couple of things that have been going on this year. We've had quite a lot on our plates. And of course, many of you, I'm sure, were up late last night, early this morning. Maybe many people had difficulty sleeping as we watch these long-awaited election results come in. And I feel like, you know, with regard to having clarity around what our next steps are as a country, you know, when the clock strikes midnight, that will be when we have an answer. But for so long, we have been living in this place of ambiguity, just a stroke before midnight, right? I feel like I've been living in this place where I'm waiting for the clock to strike midnight, and it's 1 second away, and that's been going on for about 10 months. Waiting for clarity, waiting to appreciate how we move forward with our lives in the midst of so many movements across the country and across our planet globally. And for so many reasons, I am incredibly honored to be with you here today. When I started Resilience Leadership Institute over 2 years ago, when I founded the company, I had no idea that we would be in the midst of a global pandemic right now. I had no idea that we would be in the midst of a movement looking at social inequities and Black Lives Matter in such a concerted and important and significant time in our lives. And when I stepped away from Nike as head of executive development at the end of February, I had worked really hard at the end of February of this year. I had worked really hard to book clients and to replace my own income as the head of my household with my 2 sons. And overnight, what I found was that those clients that I had booked as the pandemic advanced into the United States from Europe and other places, that all of those clients and all of that business that I had booked for the subsequent 6 months, it disappeared overnight. And like so many of you, perhaps like all of you, my life was fundamentally and forever changed. And I'm not here this morning to teach you about how to be resilient, because if you're on this Zoom call this morning, you've already had the opportunity to demonstrate resilience in your life over the course of these last few months. What I am here to do is to have a dialogue with you about how we can all enhance our resilience, accelerate our resilience, and sustain our resilience for the days and months and weeks to come, as our lives and the way that we have known ourselves and each other continues to shift and change under our feet. And what I'd like to start with this morning is a quote that's been near and dear to my heart. This is by Rumi. Many of you may be familiar with Rumi. He's a 14th century Sufi poet from Iran, a Persian poet. And he wrote beautiful words that are as applicable to our times today as they were to when he lived 600 years ago. And what Rumi said was, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And what we know is that we are in the midst of understanding what the future of our country will look like in terms of our leadership. And no matter what happens, there will be a vocal minority that is not pleased about the outcome of these election results. And what I want to share with you as we get started this morning is the significant opportunity that all of us have to be able to come together in this moment, to not let politics further divide us and separate us, but instead, as Rumi said, to move out beyond our own ideas of right and wrong, and instead go into that collective field together, to meet there, and to begin to repair and replenish ourselves, regardless of the results of the election. Because I think what we can't handle in our country is further division and further separation from one another. And as we think about this momentous occasion and how we sustain ourselves relative to resilience, what I want to start with are 3 ways that you can think about your own resilience. They're practical, they're tactical, and you can put them into play right away. The first is assuming positive intent. Now, I know typically we don't want to assume things. We say, if I assume, right, that makes a donkey, if you will, out of me and you. And what we find is that this is a tender time for all of us. This is a keyed up time for all of us. And yet, very few people, very few of us wake up in the morning saying, you know what, I'm going to see what I can mess up today. I'm going to see who I can upset. I'm going to see what trouble I can get into. The vast, vast majority of us are moving through the world with an idea that we're doing our very best. And so if we can extend grace to one another during this time, if we can assume positive intent, I think that when each of us does that individually, that creates a collective and a world of change. I remember a story that a friend of mine told me recently where she was at a stoplight. And when she was at the stoplight, she happened to look at her phone and receive a text message that her father had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And she burst into tears. She was overwhelmed with the experience of understanding that her father had been diagnosed with such a late stage cancer and she might lose him. And at that very moment when she was in her car and she was crying, she started to hear horns behind her. People were honking at her to move because the light had changed from red to green. And so often when that happens, we assume that the person in front of us isn't paying attention, that they're being a jerk. But what we truly don't know is we don't ever know the full story that's behind anyone's experience. And so I would invite all of us today to assume positive intent first and foremost as we live and work and move through the world in this tender time. The second thing that I'd like to share is to find joy in the journey. In fact, if you look closely at the word journey, the word joy is embedded in the word journey. Our journeys have been difficult and ambiguous and arduous and challenging and trying and tumultuous and scary. And yet, we've also found gold and beauty and tenderness and vulnerability and authenticity and connection in the midst of this pandemic. And to the extent that we can find joy in our daily lives, I think this appreciably impacts how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to each other. You see, life is what happens when we're making other plans. And so often we say to ourselves, I'll be happy when. I'll be happy when I get out of quarantine. I'll be happy when my kids go to school and I have to stop doing this virtual learning. I'll be happy when I lose 20 pounds. I'll be happy when I find a partner. And then we find a partner, our kids go back to school, we lose 20 pounds, and we say, but I'll be happy when I hit the next milestone. And the point is that happiness is not about having things. It's not about doing things. We first have the opportunity to be. So often we say, I have to have something in order to be happy. But instead, the first step is to be happy, to find joy, to find the kernels of beauty in each day of our lives, especially if it's just one kernel. And the third piece is to seek to understand. So often we want to be understood, we want to be heard, we want to be seen, we want to feel safe, and all of those things are incredibly important for us as humans. But when we offer to other people what we desire to receive in return, then we give everyone around us a gift and we start a movement. We seek first to understand, and following that, we will be understood. So many of us, myself included, have felt fearful of these times. What will happen next? How will our leadership in the country handle these events? How will our laws change? How will we relate to each other in different ways? Will civil liberties and rights be infringed upon or changed in some way? And there's been so much anger, so much division around politics. And what I'd like to share is that when we first seek to understand, when we take a step closer to the people that might have different views or different experiences from us, what we do is we narrow the gap between our personal belief of self and other. And when we get closer to the people and the things that initially made us feel fearful, what we realize is that fear can't thrive in proximity. We first have the opportunity to understand, and when we get close to people, when we seek to understand their perspective, we begin to eliminate the sense of fear and scarcity that exists between us. And so as we think about clothing ourselves, equipping ourselves with a couple of key areas in our lives where we can make an appreciable difference for ourselves and the people around us. Just as we put on our pants and our shoes and our shirt in the morning, we can clothe ourselves with positive intent. We can clothe ourselves in finding joy and finding the kernels of joy in the journey. And we can first seek to understand and clothe ourselves with that grace that we offer to other people. Now, what I'd like to do is tell you a story about Nelson. Nelson was a little boy growing up in a small town in a small village. The vast majority of his family was illiterate and didn't attend school. Nelson was known as a troublemaker growing up, but he also showed a flair for the academics. And when he had the opportunity to attend school, he thrived. And as he progressed through his education, what his family found was that he had the aptitude to be the first one in his family to attend university. He also faced significant hardship. What he found as he was growing up was that a significant loss occurred, and that was the death of his mother as a young boy, a loss that was very difficult for him to move past, and perhaps he never got over it. Now, when Nelson went to university, he became friends with a crowd of people that the university didn't approve of. And unfortunately for Nelson, he was expelled after his first year at university. On his way home, his father was disappointed in him. And Nelson got word that in order to straighten the boy out, his father was going to have him married. Because that's what we should do with all wayward sons and daughters, right? Is get them married. That solves everything, as we know. Well, Nelson didn't want to get married, and so instead of returning home, he went to a neighboring town and he picked up odd jobs and piecemeal work. He was homeless for a period of time. He worked as a night watchman, but was fired from that role when he was found to be a runaway. And so as a young man in his late teens and early 20s, he was pulling together jobs without family support, living as a homeless person oftentimes, didn't have health insurance, and the types of buffers that we think are important to be resilient within the context of our society. And if I checked in with all of you at this moment and I asked you, how hopeful are you feeling about Nelson's future? How resilient do you believe that Nelson truly is? Perhaps the vast majority of you would not be feeling very hopeful about what Nelson's future has in store. And that's okay, because what I want to share with you is that this is also the little known story of the well-known Nelson Mandela. See, many people don't know about the hardship and Nelson's backstory before he became an icon of taking down apartheid. And I tell you this story for two reasons. The first one is, what I find when I work with people is that so often we tell ourselves stories about whether or not we are resilient, and whether or not we can be a leader, and whether or not we can have the dreams that we always wanted and the partner that we always wanted. And we think that when we have experienced hardship and challenge, it diminishes us in some way, and that we become less eligible to have those dreams and hopes and experiences that we'd always wished for. And what we find is that resilience meets us where we are. And resilience is not about living a perfect life. It's about when challenge shows up, inevitably, when, not if, we rise to that occasion. The second reason that I tell you this story is that so often the things that have happened to us become the stories we tell about who we are. And when we tell that story over and over again, it becomes our narrative. It becomes our identity. And what Nelson Mandela realized, looking back on his life in his autobiography, was that these challenges that he faced equipped him to live a better life later on, to show up for the considerable challenges that he would face as a political icon and as someone who challenged racism in his country. And so these challenges did not diminish him. They in fact enhanced him. And what his narrative became was one of power, one of personal agency, one of overcoming, one of effectively addressing challenge, rather than being a little boy who didn't finish university and lived for a period of time as a homeless person. And so what's important for us to realize is that the things that happened in our lives, the challenges that we faced, that will always be part of who we are. But our story of what happened to us does not need to be our narrative. We don't need to make those things our identity. We get to decide from the stories that we've experienced what our narrative and what our true identity relative to resilience is. Now, we've all been facing a significant amount of difficulty, trauma, loss, fear, uncertainty. And what we're finding is that in everything that we are facing collectively, there's not just one challenge, of course. Prior to this global pandemic, to our global movements, our national movements, what we found is that we were already overtaxed. We were stressed. We were part of 24/7 technology. We were engaged in mergers and acquisitions and restructuring. And none of that necessarily has gone away. If anything, a number of us have, as I did, lost clients, lost livelihoods, have been furloughed, have had our hours diminished. And then on top of that, this global pandemic arriving, known as COVID-19, a movement that is looking closely at the social fabric of how we relate to one another in terms of Black Lives Matter. And as we take all of this in, there is such a macro level of stress and uncertainty before we ever get to our jobs, before we ever get on our first meeting, before we ever open our first email. And what we find is that resilience was nice to have before COVID-19 showed up. And now resilience it becomes the premier operating system for us to address these high stress and high impact environments. And of course, there's one thing that I didn't mention that's also of critical importance, and that is facing ambiguity. Now, here's a little bit of resilience humor for you. Ambiguity is what happens in vagueness stays in vagueness. Now, of course, we're all living in an ambiguous space. We don't know what the outcome of this pandemic will be. We don't know what our future looks like. And this notion of control is being challenged on a regular basis. And I think it's important for us to realize that in the words of Stephen Covey, we have the opportunity to control the controllables. Now, we didn't lose control of our lives in the midst of this pandemic. It's that we never had control in the first place. And so what we're being challenged with is our own belief system about our own agency and what we're actually able to impact, and living more deeply into an environment of ambiguity and uncertainty, for which resilience is not just a prerequisite, not just a nice to have, but critical to our ability to be able to sustain ourselves and even accelerate our development and our contributions over time. And so now I'd love to hear from all of you. I'd love to know what resilience means to you. And what you can do is just very easily in the chat, share a word, a phrase, a person that represents resilience for you. We'd love to understand, for the 271 of you that are joining us today, how are you thinking about resilience? What's coming up for you? And when you think about a word or a person or a phrase, how do you think about resilience? Susan's leading us off with persistence. We've got strength and flexibility coming in. Just keep swimming, your daughter. I won't get all of these coming through. Assuming positive intent, yes! Exhaustion, to be honest, right? I get it. We're going to talk about that. Fluidity, courage, holding one's vision despite obstacles. My 93-year-old grandmother, oh my gosh, Karen, she sounds amazing. I'd love to hear about her. Bouncing back, getting back up, not giving up, resilience, self-compassion, connection, holding plans loosely, family, keeping faith, determination wrapped in hope. So incredible, sharing kindness and gratitude with others, power and hope for the youth, speaking and writing our truth, battling cancer, my children, quickly recover from difficulty and mental toughness, fighting through, another just keep swimming. You are all amazing. And I love hearing about breathing, right? I know sometimes resilience is just getting through the day, taking one breath in and one breath out. And sometimes that is the best we can do in a moment. Integrity, flexibility, staying positive. Toy that I had as a child that I would punch and it would pop back up again because it was waiting. Oh, right. Yeah, Suzanne, that was like one of those, I think it's called a Bobo doll, where you punch it and it goes down and then pops back up. I love that. Youth and foster care, amazing. Bounce back, thank you. We're gonna talk about that. Palm trees, yes, I love palm trees. Hardiness. Oh, you all have so many amazing ideas, and it's such a joy to learn from all of you. So as we move on here together, what I want to share with you is a definition of resilience, and it's simple and practical. Resilience is the ability to effectively address challenge in a manner that allows us to be enhanced by the experience, not diminished. That's it. That's what resilience is. We face challenge effectively in a manner that allows us to be enhanced by the experience, not diminished. So often we think that we're not supposed to feel things that happen in our lives. We think we're supposed to be tough. We think we're supposed to be Teflon. We're supposed to soldier through. And what we find in resilience is that is simply not true. And I'm going to talk more about vulnerability and what that means. The second piece is we often think that we're supposed to quickly recover. And what we find is that oftentimes the people that recover the quickest are not the ones that are demonstrating the most resilience, because allowing ourselves to feel an experience, to integrate that experience takes time. Resilience isn't about quickly recovering. Resilience is about taking the time that we need to rehabilitate ourselves and to integrate what it means to have addressed effectively a particular challenge in our lives. Now, I came to study resilience over a decade ago. And I remember when my two sons were young babies and I would be in a coffee shop during their nap time. The only time that you parents know that is truly, well, maybe it's not even truly your own, but it's a time when you get to rest during the day. And I thought, what am I doing? These 2 hours that my babies are asleep and I could be watching Netflix or sleeping myself or doing something different. And instead I'm here at this coffee shop, coding data, writing articles, and researching resilience. And what I heard at that time was, Taryn, this is going to be important one day. Continue in this work. And what I began to do is I wanted to understand when we inevitably face challenge, change, and complexity, what we can do in those moments to effectively address challenge. Imagine knowing in those moments when challenge shows up and we feel like we want to run or fight or we feel paralyzed, that we had a series of tools that we knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that when I do this thing or these things, that is going to make an appreciable difference in terms of not only how I face this challenge, but create a more positive outcome by way of demonstrating resilience. And so what I began to do was ask a simple but powerful question. And you may want to think about this question for yourself today. When you faced a significant challenge in the past, what have you done to effectively address that challenge? I'd love for you to reflect on as you faced significant challenge. What was it you did that as you look back on that was effective and allowed you to face that challenge? And as we walk through the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, I'd love for you to check and see, does this encapsulate what you did? What made a difference from you? And hear from all of you, does this fit for you? Or did I miss something? Or would you add on to this framework and model? Now, so often what we know, or what we think we know about resilience is not actually accurate. The first myth of resilience is that we bounce back. We use this language without even thinking about it. And so many people have come to me and they've said, Dr. Taryn, I've really tried to be resilient, but I find that no matter what I do, I don't go back to the way that I was before the challenge. And so I wonder if I'm not actually as resilient as I think. And so this belief in bouncing back actually becomes insidious. It becomes harmful. Because what we know is that we are fundamentally and forever changed by every experience that we have in our lifetimes. And the myth is that we bounce back. The truth is that we bounce forward. We're not going back to the way things were. We're not going back to work. We're going forward with our lives in a way that looks and feels incredibly different. We're going forward to work and we're interacting with each other in a new and different way. We won't go back to the way that we were before. And so we may need to grieve losses of things that we had in our past lives that are not going to return or are not going to return for some time. And then replace those things with hoped for outcomes, with strength, with wisdom that occurs when we face challenge. The second myth of resilience is that resilience is fixed or finite, that we only get a certain amount of resilience, or we're resilient or not resilient, and that's it for the rest of our lives. And what we find is that this is fundamentally not true. In fact, not only are we given a certain amount of resilience, all of us are resilient, but like a muscle, we can grow and develop our resilience over time, primarily by facing challenge. And the third myth is that resilience is passive. So often we say things like, time heals all wounds, which communicates to ourselves and others that time just has to pass and then we'll feel better. But it's more akin to what Andy Warhol said, which is time changes things, but you have to change them yourself. Resilience is active, not passive. And so after I interviewed hundreds of people and collected thousands of pieces of data, we created the empirical framework, the research evidence-based framework, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. These practices are vulnerability, productive perseverance, connection, gratiosity, and possibility. And in our time together today, we're going to go deep into 2 of these practices, vulnerability and possibility. However, I'm going to tell you a little bit about productive perseverance, connection, and gratiosity, so you know those 2. Productive perseverance is about the intelligent pursuit of a goal, knowing when to maintain the mission and when to pivot in a new direction. It's an art and it's a science. Many people ask me about Angela Duckworth's work on grit, and they say, Taryn, is grit resilience? Are those 2 the same thing? Are they different? Well, grit is part of productive perseverance. Grit is the part about staying the course, maintaining the mission despite challenge. But many times what we find is that our goals have diminishing returns when the environment around us has shifted and changed in a significant way, as it has in the midst of this pandemic. And so it's also important that we pick our heads up and we look around and we say, are these still the right goals? And look at how we might shift and change and augment ourselves in order to go forward to work. A great story that encapsulates this is Vera Wang. Some of you may know her as an iconic fashion designer. Now, what many people don't know is that Vera Wang was a figure skater. She was an Olympic hopeful and wanted to make the US team. But when she didn't make the US team to go to the Olympics, she realized that although she had attempted to maintain the mission, she was going to need to pivot and grow in a new way. And so she had the opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, if I'm not doing figure skating, what might I do instead? What passion might I pursue? And she said to herself, you know, I do like fashion, and the rest, as they say, is history. And so for all of us that have felt in the midst of the pandemic that we were maintaining the mission, we were following our goals, we were pursuing our dreams, and when those things are removed from us, we have the opportunity to look again at our environment, to look again at ourselves, and to see what the new opportunity is to pivot in a new direction. We also have connection as the 3rd practice of particularly resilient people. Connection is both internal and external. It's about the internal connection that we have ourselves, trusting ourselves, our intuition or our gut, believing in ourselves, listening to that still small voice within and allowing that voice to be heard, even when everyone around us might feel or seem like their voices are louder. And once we've established this connection within ourselves, then being able to connect deeply with those outside of ourselves, our family members, our children, our friends, our peers, our teams, our broader organization, our community. You know, I did some research at the start of the pandemic, and I wanted to understand in other types of situations where there's been famine or natural disaster, you know, who are the most resilient people? And so often we think of these survivalists, right, that are like out in the middle of the woods and they've got years worth of canned goods and lots of firearms, right? And these are the people that are most resilient, right? They cut themselves off from connection with the outside world. And what I actually found was the people that were most resilient in pandemics and in moments of natural disaster were the people that had the greatest number of connections in the context of their community. They weren't the people that were living out by themselves. They were the people who were deeply connected to themselves and within the context of the organizations and the relationships that they had. And they were able to not only support others by bringing people together and leveraging their network and their social connections, but they were also the ones that were able to support themselves because they were a convener of people and they were able to bring people together in order to create social change and to make a difference. The fourth practice that I want to briefly touch on is the practice of gratiosity. Now, if you've not ever heard this word before, that is okay, because I made it up when I was doing qualitative research. A little known fact that you can make up words when you do this kind of work. So gratiosity encapsulated what I felt I was hearing from people when I was asking them about effectively addressing challenges. And people would talk about gratitude. They'd talk about even if a challenge that they faced wasn't something they would have chosen, they were deeply grateful for the experience and they could see how that experience grew and shaped them. And then the generosity piece, where they were able to share those lessons generously with others so that others might learn vicariously from their experience. And they not only up-level themselves by sharing these lessons, but offer these learnings as a way to up-level others in their network and their circle. And now we'll take a deeper dive into vulnerability. The resilient practice of vulnerability is about the ability to holistically integrate our internal and external selves. And this is the cornerstone of authenticity and empathy and requires overcoming the shame bias. Now, what is the shame bias, you ask? I'm so glad you did. The shame bias is that we think about someone else's vulnerability, the challenges they faced, and them sharing those authentically. And as we think about people who share authentically and vulnerably, we tend to think more of those people. And yet, when we think about sharing our own resilient story, our own vulnerability, we believe that even though we think more of others, that we'll be diminished in some way by sharing who we truly are. See, the shame bias tells us that if we are vulnerable, if we show people our true selves, our true colors, that three things will happen. I call them the 3 L's. That if people truly knew us, we're afraid that they wouldn't like us, they wouldn't love us, and they would leave. And this belief, this untrue, faulty shame bias that people wouldn't like us, wouldn't love us, and would leave, leads us to stay tight within the bud as opposed to blooming and allowing people to see who we truly are. In order to overcome the shame bias, this belief that our challenges will diminish us rather than enhance us in the eyes of others, what we have to do is we have to take the leap of faith. We get to take the leap of faith to be vulnerable. And in that moment, in our vulnerability, what we find is that others feel more deeply connected to us because they deeply know us. And we're able to be our authentic and truest selves. Now, what's important to understand around vulnerability is that oftentimes our vulnerability is dictated by what we say to ourselves in our own heads. See, many of us are living in homes where we have an expensive mortgage. Realtors often say, when you purchase a home, that is the most expensive investment that you will ever make in your life. And what I want to do is I want to respectfully disagree with this, because the most important investment, the most important real estate that we will invest in is actually right up here. It's the thoughts, it's the messages, it's the words that we say to ourselves in our own heads. without even saying a word out loud. So often we say things to ourselves that are mean and cruel and things that we would never accept from another person. But somehow it's okay when we say them to ourselves. And what's important for you to know is that whatever we say up here in our heads, that is who we become. What follows I am follows you. When you say to yourself, I am brilliant and capable, I am valued and important, what I do is meaningful, then you will become those things that you say to yourself. And when we tell ourselves, I'm not worthy, I'm not enough, I'm messing up, I'm a failure, there's something wrong with me, that too is what we become. The words that we say to ourselves in our heads is the version of ourselves that we will become in the future. You want to know what your future is going to look like? Your crystal ball is how you talk to yourself today, and that is who you will become tomorrow. What follows I am follows you. So be careful about this real estate up here in your head. This is in fact your most important and expensive real estate. Recognize what you're saying to yourself and allow yourself to be kind and generous so that you get to overcome the shame bias and reach your full potential. The second practice that we want to dive more deeply into is the resilient practice of possibility. The ability to see possibilities and potential for progress in the face of obstacles. What we have at the Resilience Leadership Institute is the Resilience Factor Index, or the RQI, where we're able to look at individuals, teams, and broader organizations and understand, based on this single factor, how resilient people will be able to be in environments that are riddled with the potential for fear and failure. So often what we find in our lives in moments of business and also in the pandemic and so many other myriad of experiences that we're facing is that there is both risk and opportunity. And possibility is the equation of risk plus opportunity. Now, it's so easy oftentimes to over-prioritize risk, to look at all of the things that are changing and scary and fearful and say, I can't go out there, that's too much. And sometimes we ignore fear, we ignore risk, we ignore our better judgment, and we just look at the opportunities or the possibilities. And the practice of possibility, the resilient practice of possibility, is about being able to equally and effectively navigate the polarity that exists between both risk and opportunity. And what we find is that there's often so much wisdom in language. The Chinese, in their character for crisis, it's a compilation of two Chinese characters, the character for danger and the character for opportunity creates the Chinese character for crisis. And so what we know from the resilient practice of possibility is what the Chinese have known all along in the context of this character for crisis, that when there is a crisis, when there is something that we're afraid of, when there is a pandemic, we live in this tension between navigating both the danger and the opportunity. And being able to navigate the polarity of those two is what allows us to be maximally resilient. And what I want to talk about for a moment is this idea of innovation and more wisdom in our language, in the English language. What we find at the Resilience Leadership Institute is that the most resilient organizations relative to that RQI factor are often the organizations that are most innovative. And the most innovative organizations are often the organizations that are most resilient. As Thomas Edison said, I didn't fail 9,999 times in trying to create the light bulb. I just found 9,999 ways that it didn't work. And that's the difference between resilience and living from a place of possibility versus a place of fear and scarcity. We keep trying, we keep going. We may need to try 9 times, 900 times, 9,000 times, 999 times. But continuing to try, continuing to harness and develop our resilience and stay in the game, no matter how afraid we are, no matter how different this environment looks compared to what we're used to. This creates innovation, this creates change, and this allows us to up-level and uplift. Now, something that you didn't learn about me in my bio is that I'm dyslexic. I was diagnosed with dyslexia at 37 years old. So for those of you that are keeping track, I went through all of my schooling, my doctorate degree, and my fellowship without any accommodations for a severe and significant learning disability. And I did that because I always knew that there was something wrong with the way that I learned, or I should say something different about the way that I learned from other students. I had a great deal of difficulty reading. And what I found is that I had to look very closely at words as I pronounced them because I could easily misread them with my dyslexia. And what I found was that the word scared and the word sacred are essentially the same word, just with the C in a different place. And I thought, in the wisdom of the English language, perhaps fear is not a bad emotion. Perhaps we shouldn't run from fear or numb fear or ignore fear in the inevitable moments that it shows up in our lives. In fact, really important experiences like bravery and courage can't exist without the presence of fear. And what I began to understand is that it's not about running from the things that scare us, ignoring the things that scare us, or taking fear as a cue that something is a bad idea and should be avoided. In fact, what I found in my time doing this research in my own life and in the lives of hundreds of other people that I've had the opportunity to interview is that in fact what scares us or what scares you is sacred, meaning the things that scare you at this moment in your life are likely not the things to hide from, but rather feeling scared identifies our most sacred development opportunities, our most sacred moments for growth. And so rather than believing that we need to be fearless, instead we can embrace fear and learn to fear less, not allow fear to stop us, but instead invite fear in so that we can be brave and courageous and pursue those most sacred aspects of facing our own fear and allowing it to develop us. And so in summary, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people are vulnerability, productive perseverance, connection, grandiosity, and possibility. And as we close our time together today in this keynote, what I'd like to speak to is another pandemic that's happening alongside COVID-19. And this is the pandemic of loneliness. See, 61% of people that were surveyed through Cigna, an organization with whom I used to work, believed or endorsed that they were either lonely or very lonely. This means that 330 million Americans endorse that they are lonely or very lonely. What we also know is that loneliness has significant impacts on our health. When we don't have enough social support and too few social interactions, we have reduced physical and mental health. And this can be as significant to our health as smoking a pack of cigarettes or 15 cigarettes a day. What we also know is that loneliness is not good for business. When people are lonely or very lonely, they have lower productivity, they are more missed days at work, more absenteeism, lower quality of work and engagement, and a higher risk of turnover. 61% of people were lonely or very lonely. Now here's the kicker. This study was conducted in 2018, before we were ever in quarantine in the midst of a pandemic. I don't know what these numbers are today, but I am frightened for all of us to find out. And what I know is that each one of you that are here today have likely felt some degree of loneliness over the course of these last months. And you're also in touch with people that are likely feeling lonely or very lonely. And when we think about resilience as a fundamental survival skill, what we recognize is that our connections to ourselves and others is going to be the element that gets us through this time. Our vulnerability, our willingness to reach out to other people and to share honestly and authentically what is happening in our lives, the challenges that we're facing, and allow ourselves to be truly seen and to truly experience deep human connection in a way that we're able to address and maybe even remediate loneliness. And many people think of resilience as something that we do individually. And what I've had the opportunity to do is to also begin to understand resilience in the context of what that means for teams and more broadly organizations and communities. Systemic resilience, if you will, not just individual, but how we can collectively create resilience so that a rising tide lifts all boats. And what we find in this article that I had the privilege of co-writing in Forbes with Keith Ferrazzi is that teams fail or succeed together by collectively enhancing or detracting from one another's resilience. You see, resilience isn't just about our own individual performance. Resilience also becomes a team sport in our communities, in our families, and within our organizations. And it's not about simply our own resilience, but allowing that rising tide to lift all boats, so that rather than believing that we are in a race, an individual race where we cross the finish line and we're the winner, instead we have this attitude that we cross the finish line together. And all of you have the opportunity today, in the spirit of understanding the pandemic of loneliness that we're currently in, to reach out to one another, to cultivate that connection, and to think about how you will continue to stay in touch with the most important people in your lives, how you will deeply support people and receive support during this time, and how you will allow those around you to help you cross the finish line and bring people across the finish line with you. In closing, I want to talk about something known as the Stockdale paradox. You may be familiar with the Stockdale paradox. It was popularized in Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. Admiral Stockdale was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War, and he, along with many other American soldiers, were held in exceedingly brutal conditions for many years. And after Admiral James Stockdale was released from captivity and returned to the United States, he was interviewed and he was asked, who were the people who didn't survive mentally or physically in that horrific environment of being a prisoner of war? And what he said surprised many people. He said, that's easy. It was the optimists. And as we all read that article, we said, what? The optimists? They were the ones that had the greatest difficulty? Aren't we supposed to all be optimistic? And what Admiral James Stockdale said was, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. And I believe, even though we are not prisoners of war, many of us during this time have felt that we are prisoners in our own home, prisoners of the macro level politics and environments in which we live. And what's important to realize is that we must never lose faith in a positive outcome, and also not run away, hide, or ignore the brutal facts of our current reality, whatever they might be. What Stockdale teaches us is that it's not just about being optimistic, It's about being realistic. It's about allowing ourselves to maintain a sense of faith and belief in a more positive and beautiful future, and also allowing ourselves to see clearly our current environment. When we ignore the facts of what currently exists for us, it doesn't allow us to be resilient because we don't allow ourselves to deeply connect with what's truly happening in each of our lives. Many of us feel that we need to be positive, or that we need to be positive all the time, or that being positive is somehow a betrayal to people that are having a more difficult time. And maybe we don't deserve to be in a good mood. Maybe we don't deserve to celebrate the milestones that we're experiencing. And what I want to share with you is the only insane thing is to believe that we need to be sane all the time. And so allow yourself to have spaces and places where you can let your hair down, where you can lean on and be helped and carried by other people, just as you are helping and caring many others. Allow yourself to stay sane by believing that sometimes we need to feel a little insane, and that's all right. As long as we never, ever, ever lose faith in the belief that we will indeed prevail and indeed realize a positive outcome. As we close together today, I want to invite you to do one thing differently. You've seen this content, you've seen suggested areas, practical ways that you can change your life. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what some of those early ways that you can make a fundamental difference in your life are. But consider some aha moments from today's talk. Perhaps it's bouncing forward as opposed to bouncing back. Perhaps it's the belief that resilience is active and not passive. That, as Andy Warhol said, you have to change, time changes things, but you have to change them yourself. Perhaps it's the definition of resilience, that resilience is simply about effectively addressing challenge and allowing it to, over time, enhance us, not diminish us. Perhaps you learned that even though you may have a story about what you experienced in your life, you can change your narrative and decide how you want that to influence and inform your identity. I would love to think about what this means in terms of, for you personally, for your client or member relationships that you have, or your colleague relationships within your own organization. And write down, don't just think it in your mind, right? But what is the one thing, the small but meaningful change you're going to make? And write it down on a piece of paper and say, I am resilient by. What is the one thing that you will do differently or continue to do or enhance in order to harness what you learned about resilience today? I'd love to hear from you about what that thing is. You can share that with me on social media. You can also use the hashtag #IamResilientBy to share your commitment and allow us to begin to support you as a community. But the worst thing that could happen is you get off this keynote, you get off this webinar, and you don't allow this to change you. Pull in some of this information and allow it to become part of who you are so that you can begin to harness your resilience in this moment. Allow it to change you. In closing, when we think about harnessing resilience in leadership, we not only have the 5 practices of particularly resilient people in leadership and in life, but we also have what we talked about at the beginning, assuming positive intent. There's also finding purpose in the pause. For many of us, our lives have slowed down to a great degree. We're not traveling, we're staying home much more than we ever did. And recognizing that in these moments, we get to find purpose in the midst of our lives changing significantly and fundamentally. Recognize that when we create meaning, that meaning must come from within. So often we say, to look outside of ourselves for meaning. We say, well, there's a reason for everything that happened. But in fact, when we think about looking for a reason, we deny ourselves the ability to look internally. And instead of asking others why things are happening, we get to look within and make meaning for ourselves around our own experience. As we talked about in the beginning, finding moments of joy in the journey, even if that's just a kernel of joy in the journey. As we discussed, the only insane thing is expecting yourself to be sane all the time. And what I'd love for you to do is to decide from today on, determine how you will bounce forward. When we look at the word resilience, there's also a word called silience, not silence, silience. What the word silience means is that we mine deeply within ourselves and we find the gems within, the talents, the knowledge, the strength, the experience that we didn't even know existed within ourselves. And we honor those parts of ourselves. And when we understand the definition of the word silience, we can better understand the definition of the word resilience. Because if silience is about finding these capabilities, these strengths, these aspects of who we are that are deeply important and incredibly integral to our talents and our knowledge and our wisdom, resilience is about finding those parts of ourselves that we may not have even known existed and bringing them forth in order to effectively address challenge, change, and complexity. I know we're going to have time for question and answer now. I'd love to stay in touch with you. Here is to all of you bouncing forward. You can connect with me on social media, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram, email me. And what I'd invite you to do is, in the words of Nelson Mandela, to not judge yourself too harshly, but instead, as Nelson Mandela said, do not judge me by my successes. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again. You see, it's not if we're going to fall, it's when we fall that we have the courage and the ability and the willingness to keep standing back up. I've loved being here with all of you today, and I can't wait to hear your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Taryn. Our first question is coming from Marco Ramirez.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you great. Hi, say your name again.
Hi, my name is Marco Ramirez. I work with the YMCA of Greater Richmond, and I can't start my video, says the host won't allow it, so I apologize. But I just wanted to say—
we'd love to see you, but it's okay. I had that issue too.
That is okay. I wanted to say thank you so much. Your presentation was incredible, and I think it's going to be impactful for so many of us, both at work and I think our families and our own personal journey. I was texting my wife as you were talking, and she said, bring as many notes home as you can. So very, very great. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask your thoughts and opinions on the role social media has on our resiliency, and any tips you might offer to make sure that social media remains something positive.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting is, I think that's an incredibly important question, Marco. And what's interesting is, in that loneliness study that I referenced that we did at Cigna, when we looked at loneliness generationally, the loneliest generation was actually Generation Z, or the digital natives. And now right away, you might extrapolate from that. You might say, yeah, because they're on social media all the time and not really connecting with people prior to the pandemic. But what we actually found was that social media did not impact people's loneliness. Now, social media impacts a lot of other things, right? It impacts, perhaps like how we feel about ourselves, our own self-esteem, that kind of thing. Many people recognize that, after scrolling through Facebook or Instagram for a period of time, they're not necessarily feeling better about themselves, and sometimes we're feeling worse, right? And so I would say a couple of things about social media. The first thing that I would say is that social comparison is the enemy of joy. So anytime we put ourselves in a position where we are comparing ourselves to other people, which often happens on social media, right? It's like, oh, do I look as good in a bikini as she does? Marco, I know this is what you're thinking. Do I look as good in a bikini as she does, right? But like, is my house as big as they are? Do I making this money? Am I going on vacation? Blah, 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 right? It's a little different in the pandemic. But when we start to compare ourselves socially to other people, that's when we begin to feel bad about ourselves. And so a beautiful way that we can think about social media where we can shift, right, the script in our heads is when we see someone who has something that we don't have, we can practice something that is lesser known in our society called vicarious joy. Okay, vicarious joy. There's actually there's no English word for this. There's a Sanskrit word. The Sanskrit word is mudita, right? And vicarious joy means that, Marco, when I'm on Instagram and I see that big bass that you caught in the lake over the summer, right? I don't say to myself, man, Marco's, fish is bigger than mine, right? When I see that beautiful, those beautiful holiday decorations you post online, these are just illustrative examples, right? I'm not like, the decorations are better than mine. But instead, right, I have vicarious joy. I say, the beautiful things happening in Marco's life are also happening for me. And I feel joy for what Marco is experiencing. And then rather than engaging in this mindset of social comparison that has, been just short of hardwired into our heads, instead we began to feel grateful and thankful for the blessings that people are experiencing and sharing on social media. I know there's a lot of other questions. The second thing that I'll just share about social media is we've seen more vulnerability and authenticity in social media than I think we've ever seen, during the pandemic, and I love that. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to think about how each one of us has a role and an opportunity to play in terms of showing up in a vulnerable and authentic way. I posted a beautiful picture of my sons, me holding my younger son, who was 5 at the time, with my older son next to me at Disney World. And we're standing in front of the castle, and it's so beautiful. And, it's such a blessing, to be able to take the children to Disney World and to be able to have, the resources to do that. Now, right after we took that beautiful picture, my older son pinched my younger son, and my younger son slapped him across the face. And there was this smack, and everybody stopped in front of the Disney castle, and I was like, oh my God, this just went from being the best moment of my life to the worst moment of my life, right? And so when I posted that picture, I wasn't all like, Disney's amazing, everything's perfect. I was like, this is an amazing picture. And right after this picture, things went south fast, right? So I think we all have an opportunity to be able to engage in our own vulnerability and authenticity toward creating deeper connection with one another on social media.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Taryn, we're going to take one more question from Helena Martinez.
Helena, so excited.
Hi. Thank you so much for all the tools that you shared with us. I will definitely be adopting those as I can. My question is, what is one tangible and effective way to start to build resilience within a team and or organization?
Yeah, great question. Great question, Helena. Can we discuss, your background is amazing.
Thank you. It's Zoom background, so.
Girl, beautiful. Love it. Okay, question is, what is one tangible, practical, effective way to enhance resilience in a team context? So what I'll tell you is that Forbes article, easy to find online, Resilience is a Team Sport. It'll tell you for each of the 5 practices, one small practical thing. And I'll get the link to Sydney, and she can share it out with all of you so you have it, right? That'll be one of our follow-up resources. So there's a lot in that article. One thing that's not in the article, insider track for you, Helena, is pay close attention. Oh, look, Turong just shared the link to the Forbes article. You guys are amazing, seriously. One thing that's not in the article is hold yourself and your team members accountable for the language that you use. Okay, so just think about it this way, right? If you're like, hey, Taryn, what's on your to-do list for the balance of the day? I'm like, well, I got to go pick up my kids from school, and then I got to do this proposal. And then, I've got to get this expense report in, right? And we start to use this like reactive language, like I have to, I've got to, I've been told to, right? And it's this reactive way of talking about the world, right? And when we stop using reactive language and instead we begin to speak from a place of possibility, and we say, I have the opportunity to, I've been gifted, okay, this is a little over the top, but I'm gonna go with it anyway. I've been gifted with the opportunity to pick my children up from school, right? Because because they're healthy and I have them and they're in school, right? It's like, remember that many of the things that we have today, we were asking for or praying for or hoping for, depending on your spiritual practice, right? 6 months ago, right? And so speaking from a place of possibility and saying, I have the opportunity to, recognizing that we have control over our lives and we don't need to be reactive, right? And so what you can do with your teams is you can say, okay, everybody, get in pairs, on Zoom, it can be Zoom rooms, talk to each other about your to-do lists, right? Go over that. And almost by default, 95% of people will use reactive language. I have to, I've been told to, gotta, and then bring people back together and say, okay, so when you talked about your to-do list, did you use these reactive words or did you use these proactive words, which are, I get to, I have the opportunity to, I'm blessed to, blah, 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 right? Like depending on how you use those words. And then have people go back and restate their to-do list, but they're only allowed to use proactive language. And what's going to happen is you'll see people smiling more, you'll see the mood lift in the room, and we start to realize that just the words that we choose, going back to your, tactical, tangible, practical, effective, when we change our language, we change our lives, because our language tells us how we feel about our world and how other people should feel about us. When we change those words, we change our experience. People get happier, the energy goes up. Did our to-do list change? No. The only thing that changed was the language we used to talk about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Terrence. This presentation has been amazing. And as folks have said in the chat, it was a great way to start our day. So thank you again for sharing space with us today and presenting on this topic. There are tons of gems in this that we definitely can put into practice today. So thank you again. I just want to share a few updates with you guys for the rest of the day and reminders. Don't forget to snap your photo in the virtual photo booth. You definitely want to be featured in our gallery. And with that, it is a part of our scavenger hunt for today. So you could knock out 2 birds with 1 stone by taking advantage of that photo booth and getting engaged with our scavenger hunt. We've listed the items of the scavenger hunt here today for our self-care day. These will also be posted on our social media platforms. So go find us, like, share, comment, and show us what you're up to today. And then as a quick review of our schedule for today, we have workshops coming up at 1 p.m. Again, all of our schedules are based on Central Standard Time. We have our workshops from 1 to 2. We have a Brave Space off the record conversation starting at 2:30. And this is truly a brave space. There is no recording and we will be having open conversation and dialogue. At 4:30, we'll have our closing general session on mental health. And at 6 p.m., we're going to have a virtual paint night. So grab whatever artistic supplies you have, brushes, paper, canvas, cardboard. You can be creative, make your own brushes. We want to come together and have a great time and create art while doing so. And so we look forward to seeing you in our other sessions today. Thank you again for being here today, and let's have a wonderful day of self-care.
Head toss, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Woo, child, tired of the bullshit. Gone, dust your shoulders off. Keep it moving, yes, Lord. bullshit. Come now, come dry your eyes. You know you a star, you can touch the sky. I know that it's hard, but you have to try. If you need advice, let me simplify. If he don't love you anymore, just walk your fine ass out the door. I do my head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Feeling good as hell. Baby, how you feeling? Woo, girl, need to kick off your shoes. Gotta take a deep breath, time to focus on you. All the big fights, long nights that you've been through. I got a bottle of tequila I've been saving for you.
Thank God. 'Cause he better know my worth. There's so much that I deserve, but I ain't worried now. I'ma let my head down. He been trying it, but not today. So girl, if he don't love you anymore,
Walk your fine ass out the door. And do your head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Shout out tonight, talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? And we gon' be on head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Yeah. Alright. Listen.
so girl, if he don't love you anymore,
Then walk your fine ass out the door. And do your head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Head talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Shout out tonight, talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? And we gon' make it right, talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Feeling good as hell. Baby, how you feeling?
feeling good as hell.
That's what I did. Woke up feeling like I just might run for president. Even if there ain't no precedent. Switching up the messaging. I'm about to add a little estrogen. Buy my whip, buy myself. Pay my rent, buy myself. Only exes that I care about are in my fucking chromosomes. I don't really need you. I'm a Macaulay Culkin, home alone. Bad bitch, diamonds in my collarbone. Yeah, yeah. Buy my whip, buy myself. Pay my rent, buy myself. Sugar, spice, and I'm nice. Show me what you made of. Crazy, sexy, cool, baby, with or without makeup. Got nothing to prove, but I'ma show you how I do.
I didn't know it was ending right there.